Mas gerais, vocês podem procurar ambos na coordenação. Também queria avisar que já foi iniciado, né, o PET, né, o Programa de Iniciação Científica, né, aí do IRI, que é intitulado Brasil Global, Desafios da Inserção Internacional Brasileira em um Mundo em Transformação. Né, a gente tem 9 alunos da graduação, né, entre PEP e PET, participando do grupo, sob a coordenação do professor Fabiano. Bom, dado esses né, anúncios, a gente vai agora, né, isso já é uma tradição, né, da aula inaugural, aproveitar a ocasião da aula inaugural para anunciar e entregar o prêmio Gerson Moura. Tá? O prêmio Gerson Moura ele foi lançado no âmbito das comemorações dos 20 anos da existência do Instituto de Relações Internacionais e todo ano, né, é escolhida por uma banca examinadora, né, essa banca examinadora formada por um professor da casa e um professor externo, que seleciona o melhor trabalho de conclusão de curso, apresentado aqui como requisito final para obtenção de grau de bacharel em Relações Internacionais. O premiado ele recebe, uma quantia em dinheiro e um direito à publicação, do artigo na revista Caderno de Relações Internacionais. Tá? Para quem não sabe, o professor Gerson Moura foi um dos fundadores do Instituto de Relações Internacionais da PUC-Rio, nascido em 1939, historiador por formação e vocação. O professor Gerson Moura obteve seu mestrado no UPERJ e doutorado pelo University College of London. Gerson Moura, além de notável professor, e admirado pelos diversos alunos, foi também pesquisador e pioneiro, dos estudos sobre a história da política externa brasileira. Tá? Ele publicou diversas obras que se tornaram ao longo das décadas referências obrigatórias para aqueles que desejam entender melhor as relações do Brasil com o mundo. Dentre os livros de Gerson Moura destacam-se Autonomia na Dependência, a Política Externa Brasileira de 1935 a 42, publicado pela editora Nova Fronteira, Tio Sam Chegou ao Brasil, de 1984, e A Campanha do Petróleo, de 1986. Tá? Os dois últimos lançados pela editora Brasiliense. Então, é com grande satisfação que o IRI hoje confere o prêmio Gerson Moura, edição 2012, a ex-aluna Bárbara Bravo, pelo trabalho intitulado A Securitização da Violência Urbana, Discursos, Imagens e Percepções do Rio de Janeiro à luz dos mega-eventos. Então, parabenizamos a vencedora, a ex-aluna Bárbara Bravo, o seu orientador, o professor Kai Henkel, e gostaríamos de entregar aqui o certificado, e justamente colocar aqui que esse trabalho reflete a marca aí de excelência do Programa de Relações Internacionais aí da PUC-Rio. Bom, então, a ex-aluna Bárbara Bravo, ela se encontra em Genebra, então ela vai ser representada aqui pelo professor orientador Kai Henkel. Bom, passo a palavra então para o professor Paulo Esteves, que vai apresentar o palestrante.
Well, before we start the lecture, another announcement. We are all thankful at IRI to the presence of a Professor Wohlforth among us. Professor Wohlforth came here to take part in Professor Laila Dawood's dissertation committee, which took place yesterday. So first of all, we have to thank you, Bill, for coming and to recognize the excellence of Leila's work, which were approved yesterday. So, congratulations. Professor Wohlforth is Daniel Webster Professor of Government at Dartmouth College, Department of Government. of which he was chair for 3 academic years between 2006 and 2009. He is author of the book Elusive Balance, Power and Perception During the Cold War, and editor of Witnesses to the End of the Cold War, and Cold War Endgame, Oral History, Analysis and Debates. He's a well-known neoclassical scholar, and his main work within this approach, he has worked within this approach on American unipolarity, especially in collaboration with Stephen Brooks. Together they have published several articles and a book, World Out of Balance, International Relations Theory and the Challenge of American Primacy. Professor Wohlforth has a PhD in political science at Yale University, and today he will give us a lecture entitled The Future of International Security. Will it resemble the recent past? So I give the floor for Professor Wohlforth. Thank you for coming. You are very welcome at ED.
Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction, and it's really exciting to be here. I can say that there is an old Chinese curse, and I think that it is probably not really true. I don't think they actually say this, but it's often said that they say this, which is, may you live in interesting times. And I can say that when I first took up the study of international relations, I was the age of most of the people in this room. And it was, indeed, those were interesting times. And ever since then, for all my life, since I was the age of most people in this room, I've been studying this subject, that is the subject taught at this Institute, International Relations. And all through that time, I will interact with people, taxi cab drivers, barbers who are cutting my hair, or there's not much left to cut, but I still occasionally have to go to the barber, and they'll say, well, what do you do for a living? I say, well, I study international relations. And they say, what an interesting time to be studying international relations. They said that in the 1970s, when we had wars in the Middle East, and we had oil embargoes. And they said it in the 1980s, when we had a new Cold War, and we had an end of the Cold War. And they said it in the 1990s, when we had the Bosnia problems and Balkans, and we had Somalia, and we had intervention. And they said it in the 2000s, with the war on terror, Afghanistan. They always say it. Times are always interesting. There's no subject you can study that is more consistently interesting than the study of international relations. And for that reason, I'm particularly delighted to be able to come down here to Rio de Janeiro, to this institute, which is now known as one of the premier places to train people in this interesting field of international relations. It's really an honor. It's really a pleasure. In fact, I hope that we have the recording, and we can take your introduction, and I'd like to make a little video of it and send it to my mother. She can see that I really finally made it. And all those years in graduate school really paid off. So today I'm speaking to you about the future of international security. Will it resemble the recent past? And let me just introduce the subject by mentioning that the study of international relations, of course, is far broader than the study of international security alone. There's many other subjects. There's development, there's institutional cooperation, there's all sorts of areas, international political economy. My area is the study of international security, which is the study of war and peace. And without claiming any precedence or priority for my subject area, I will say that the field of international relations as a scholarly academic area of inquiry grew up around and was organized around this very question of war and peace. If you look at the history of the theories of our discipline, the great account of the war in the Greek world by the historian Thucydides, written 500 years before Christ, was an account motivated by an effort to understand how war could have engulfed the Greek world. The great theorists of the Enlightenment, Thomas Hobbes, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, these are theorists who are trying to understand the relationship between the state and violence, the state and war. If we look at Machiavelli, he's trying to understand the relationship between war and statecraft. If we look at the development of international law, Grotius, the great theorist, Pufendorf, they're trying to understand whether, by law, countries can limit this scourge or this terror of war. If we look at the Realpolitik writings of the 19th century, Meineke, Weber, they are talking about the relationship between war, statecraft, and nation building. If we look at the period of the early 20th century, between the First and Second World War, when international relations as a discipline really begins to take off, what are they studying? They're studying whether an international organization, the League of Nations, can create a collective security system that will limit or ameliorate the problem of war. Needless to say, the so-called realist theorists of the middle of the last century, people like Hans Morgenthau, E.H. Carr, again, at the center of their work is this puzzle of war. The behavioral study of international relations, the scientific study. Quincy Wright's book, Origins of War, again, had its origins in this problem. Kenneth Waltz's Theory of International Relations, one of the most influential books to be written in the field, was really about only two things. One was about why balances of power reemerge, which is the subject of Professor Leila Dawood's thesis. And the other one is about why war keeps happening. Why war keeps happening. Game theory, from Thomas Schelling to James Fearon, trying to model mathematically why war happens. The field of constructivist approaches to international relations. Alex Wentz's book, for example, Social Theory of International Politics. It's about, can anarchy evolve in a way such as to reduce war? So war has always been at the center of our field, and war is changing. The nature of international security has dramatically changed. And in fact, it's changed for the good. Namely, we have witnessed in the last 25 years a dramatic, across the board, reduction in the problem of war. And that is what I want to talk to you about today. Will this trend towards reduced warfare and death by violence continue? Or are we condemned to repeat the past and sink back into a world that is more warlike than the world we see today? That's a big question, because it's asking whether you, for the next 25 years, will continue to live in a world like the one we are in now, where levels of war are low, or whether indeed international relations will become interesting for the sad and unfortunate reason that war becomes a bigger problem than it is today. I'm going to organize my remarks to you in three different parts. First, I'm going to talk about this decline in war, how warfare, organized violence is dramatically declined over the last quarter century. And then I'm going to talk very briefly about the question of why this might be the case. Why? Because, of course, we need to try to answer the question why this is the case in order to answer the final question, which is the third part of my talk, which is, will it continue? You ready? All right, let's start. So the big story here is a wonderful story which has been reported by several very important recent books. I'd like to cite in particular one by a psychologist at Harvard by the name of Steven Pinker, who wrote a book called The Better Angels of Our Nature. Also, my international relations colleague, Joshua Goldstein, has a book called Winning the War on War. These books contain really irrefutable evidence on the proposition that this problem of war, which has preoccupied international relations since its very beginning as a scholarly discipline, has undergone a radical transformation for the better, particularly over the last 25 years. First and foremost is the decline, thank goodness, the decline of great power war. Great power war being wars between the strongest, most powerful, most dangerous states in the international system, with the most capability to do harm to each other and to the rest of the world. There has not been a war, thank goodness, between these great powers since the end of the Second World War 65 years ago today. Or not exactly today, but 65 years ago. And the thing to bear in mind is that big, nasty, long, bloody wars between great powers were normal for most of the history of international relations. For 400 years, these things were going on almost all the time. If you look at the period between 1500 and 1820, take any 25-year period, any quarter century, and you'll see multiple great power wars. Killing on average somewhere between 1 and 5 million people. Of course, very hard to estimate deaths in these old wars, but people have tried. There was a break, a period of peace, briefly, in the 19th century, but then it came back with a vengeance in the 20th century with the 2 world wars, killing well over 100 million people. War, the expectation of great power war, didn't only matter for those great powers themselves, because as the old adage has it, when the elephants fight, the grass gets trampled. The prospect of these horrible great power wars cast a shadow over all of international politics, affecting things even in regions like South America, which were relatively inured from the great power war scourge, or from the problem of great power war. But there's been more than a decline in great power war since over the last 25 years. There's a decline in the expectation of great power war. In other words, there's a big difference between the first part of the great power peace, the Cold War, 1945 to 1990, and the second part, 1990 today. Because in the first part, we had no great power wars, but we lived under this fear that there might be a great power war. When I was a student in school, a pupil, used to have to do what we called in America fallout shelter drill. There'd be a bell ring, and all the kids would line up, and we'd have to go down into the nuclear fallout shelter in the basement of the school to prepare in case there's a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. You may have noticed that it's typical in schools to line up according to alphabetical order. People with the name A are first, people with names like mine, W, are at the end of the line. I would line up for the end of the line, to go to the fallout shelter and say, if there's ever a nuclear war, I'm gone. Thanks to my parents for giving me this name. And so from an early age, figured I had to study the subject and try to reduce the possibility of a nuclear war. But the fact is that when the Cold War ended, the Cold War first ended, and then the Soviet Union collapsed, since that time, although there are tensions, there are problems, there are a certain degree of rivalry, most people don't wake up every morning worried that these great powers are going to have one of these major wars. That is a huge change. The specter, the shadow of great power war has been largely removed from international politics. But there's more than just a decline in great power tension and great power war. There's an overall decline, a dramatic decline, in all interstate wars. That is, one state fights another sovereign state. This is the classic problem of war that all of these books that I mentioned to you are about: 2 sovereign states having a fight. These wars between states were ubiquitous in history, and indeed that is what Waltz was trying to explain in his book. Why do these wars keep recurring? But amazingly and wonderfully, the number and lethality, that is to say, the number of these wars and the number of people killed in these wars, has dramatically declined, especially over the last 25 years. By most counts, there's only been 4 or 5 of these interstate wars in the last 25 years. The Gulf War of the United States and its allies versus Iraq and Kuwait, Ethiopia versus Eritrea, India versus Pakistan, a small war over Kashmir, Iraq versus the coalition in 2003, and the United States against Afghanistan. So that's terrible, and the casualties of those wars are each and every one a tragedy. But to have only 4 to 5 interstate wars in 25 years is really good compared to the norm of history. And because there's a decline in great power war, because there's a decline in the expectation of great power war, and because there's a decline in interstate war, there is a decline in preparations for war. Now, you may find this surprising given the ridiculous amounts of money countries, including especially my country, spend on military expenditures, but the proportion of the global economy devoted to military expenditures is dramatically declined from around 4% in 1988 to about 2.5% today. A decline in the proportion of GDP, proportion of economic output devoted to preparing for war, which means if we today had the defense spending that existed in 1988, the world will be spending $1.8 trillion more dollars on defense this year than it actually is. That is $1.8 trillion that has been moved from some other activity of preparing for war to hopefully and presumably more peaceful endeavors. But not only has there been a decrease in great power war, expectation of great power war, and all interstate wars, there's even been a decrease in civil wars. When I was your age, this continent of Latin America, especially Central America, was racked with terrible, bloody civil wars. One of them is still going on in Colombia, but it is declining. It mainly has to do with drug-related, drug-funded insurgents against the government. It's on the decline, and there's been an across-the-board decline around the world since 1990 in the number and especially the lethality of civil wars. Now, this may be hard for you to appreciate, given the fact that we now have a terrible civil war going on in Syria, but even including Syria in the count, the number of civil wars has declined since the end of the Cold War, and the number of people dying in those wars has declined. So what this adds up to is a big, wonderful, positive story. Although war remains a tragedy, a waste, nonetheless, it is far less of a problem than it used to be. According to the Human Security Brief, the number of battle deaths in interstate wars declined from more than 65,000 a year in the 1950s to less than 2,000 a year in this decade. Bear in mind, the population of the world has more than doubled since 1950. So that means the relative impact is even more dramatically less than it was in the 1950s. To put this differently, once again, if today war were occurring between states at the level that it was in the 1950s, we'd be seeing 150 to 175,000 people dying a year instead of 2,000. This is a big positive story. It is, in fact, from a standpoint of organized violence for the problem of war, this is the best time to be alive. Your chances, or your friend's chances, or your friend's chances of getting caught up in one of these conflicts and suffering is lower than at any time we can measure in human history. This is a wonderful achievement that has occurred, one that international relations scholars need to focus on and understand. It is the biggest question, I think, or at least one of the biggest questions in our field, which is, will this continue? And that, of course, depends on why it has happened. And so that brings me to the second part of my remarks to you, which is to think about how to explain this decline. Well, truth is, we're not very good at explaining things like this. It's really hard to explain complicated, large-scale, systematic social change. Really hard. For example, in the United States, there's been a huge decline in violent crime. And no one knows why this is. No one can figure it out. Is it more police? Is it changing ideas and norms? What is it? Demographic changes, nobody can explain. And if they have trouble explaining this decline in violence within one country, just think of how hard it is to explain a decline in violence across the entire international system. But nonetheless, being academics, being social scientists, we still do it, even though we know we can't do it that well. We do it because it's part of our job to try to understand things. And so, how do people do it? Well, there's a large group of explanations. We could be here all day, and tomorrow, if I were fairly and objectively to take you through every single possible explanation. So I promise you I won't do that. There's a large group of explanations that have to do with human beings and their capacity to learn. Unlike the pessimistic realist view that human beings are condemned to a kind of depressing repetition of tragic behavior over and over again, there are many people who believe that people have this capacity they have the capacity for violence, they have the capacity for this evil, but they also have a capacity to sympathize and empathize with others and to overcome these violent ways of solving problems. And all that it takes, according to this explanation, for the good side of people to come out is the right institutions. And I say people are capable of doing horrible things, but also capable of doing wonderful things. All you need to do is give them the right institutions, the right kinds of states, and the right kinds of international norms and institutions, and this problem, the better angels of their nature, to use Steven Pinker's term, the better angel of their natures will come to the fore. So that's a huge set of explanations, many of which go into domestic politics, and they are, there's probably a very strong, there is a great deal of evidence for them. But what I'm going to do is ignore them entirely and focus on, in the remainder of my remarks, more traditional features of the international system as possible ways of explaining this decline. And here I'll focus just on a few. One very popular explanation for this decline in violence is material changes, largely material changes in the international system, technology and economic changes that conspire together to drive the costs of war up, making war really, really expensive, and drive the benefits of war down. Technology and economics, the argument is, notwithstanding what people think, notwithstanding their ideas, notwithstanding these institutions, just because of the technological changes and economic changes, wars become really expensive and you don't get very much for it. The benefits have gone down. There's two pieces of this really. One is nuclear weapons, those horrible, destructive things, which nonetheless, according to some people, make war too expensive to contemplate for states that have these nuclear weapons. So you end up with a separate peace created among the nuclearly armed states, because no one can contemplate a nuclear war out of which you end up better off with war than without war. You can't come up with a rational strategy for how you're going to wage nuclear war and it's going to be good for you. The simple logic of rational choice says any war that raises the possibility of nuclear, forget about it. We're not doing it. Which creates, even though through the awful mechanism of deterrence, it creates a zone of peace among the countries that have these nuclear weapons. That's one of these explanations. The other is that economic interdependence ties nations together so tightly that severing those ties with war makes war much more costly than it was in the past, and indeed reduces the benefits of war, because you can get anything you want through trade, through commerce, through investment. There's no need to invade and take territory. The example I always give is the United States and Canada. The United States and Canada. Here is, to the north of the United States, this wonderful country filled with natural resources, smart people who can work hard, lots of land. Why don't we just invade and take it? We're stronger than Canada. Why don't we just take it? They're pretty close to us. Okay, there's the French part. That could be a problem. But the rest of them kind of talk like us. They like hockey. They even play baseball. They have no real defenses. We're really strong. Let's just take it. Then we can add the new states. We have all that power. No need to negotiate with this pesky government in Ottawa. It would be awesome. Well, one reason for not doing it is we already get every single economic benefit we could want from interacting with Canada. The largest companies in Canada are owned by the United States. The cross-border trade between Canada and the United States is just like the cross-border trade between states within the United States. What possible material benefit could be achieved through attacking them? So given these economic interdependencies, war kind of makes no sense. And moreover, it's more costly than ever before. So that's one set of explanations. Another set of explanations has to do with international institutions, laws, norms, and practices. With the end of the Cold War in particular, the United Nations, with all of its flaws we could talk about, the institution of peacekeeping, with all the flaws we could talk about peacekeeping, new norms and new laws that help states cooperate to prevent war, with all of their flaws, nonetheless, these things have been gained in strength and enable countries to reduce war. There are all kinds of mechanisms available to governments today to try to avoid war. You can call in mediators. You can call in observers. You can have all kinds of practices and policies that are a menu available to decision makers that wasn't there, a menu that did not exist to the decision makers of 30, 40, 50, 60, and 100 years ago. So this network of peace enforcing and peace-preserving institutions and norms is another explanation for the decline in interstate and intra or civil wars over the last 25 years. So that's another explanation. Finally, let me mention the explanation that realists like me love to cite. This has to do with the international distribution of power. It has to do with the international system as old-fashioned realists think about it, which has to do with the distribution of capabilities among the major countries. Polarity. Bipolarity, multipolarity, unipolarity, if you will. And one explanation does highlight this distribution of capabilities that emerged with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Namely, it emerged, the collapse of the Soviet Union ended with one country, the United States, that had the capability to pursue a grand strategy of sustaining alliances and providing securities to key partners in regions to try to reduce the security problems in those regions. It did so purely for self-interested reasons, of course. The United States pursued this strategy not in order to make the world better. It pursued the strategy for narrow U.S. purposes. But the argument is, one outcome of it is to reduce the security problems among countries that benefit from this U.S. alliance network. So this polarity argument contains a bunch of parts. One is that at the top of the international system with these great powers, one of them is so powerful that the others just decide it doesn't make any sense to engage in a military rivalry with the United States. Balance of power politics, which were a very important cause of war in the future, are now too difficult, too expensive, too hard, and because the United States is so hard to compete with, and also less necessary because the United States alliance network to East Asia, to the Middle East, to Europe, reduces the incentives to balance. So for all of these reasons, the argument is the anarchy of the world that creates this problem of insecurity has been not eliminated, but this anarchy has been reduced, attenuated, ameliorated by the functions and actions and power of one country, the United States. That's the polarity argument. Okay, those are three possible arguments. And let me say, first and foremost, that peace researchers, in fact, most international relations scholars, are very skeptical and do not like the polarity argument. They don't believe it, and they don't want to believe it. So that is to say, the people who are gathering this data that shows a decline in violence, basically peace research institutes around the world, but particularly in Norway and in Canada, they don't like this explanation, and they're much more favorably disposed towards the second explanation of international institutions and peacekeeping and norms and laws. Well, I now want to turn in this second part of my talk for why I think the polarity explanation, the last one and the least popular one, actually is an important part of the explanation. I'm not going to claim to you that it's the only part. I'm not going to claim to you that's the only thing going on. But I want to argue that it's one important cause of this trend. First, this has to do with the weaknesses of the other explanations. And I'll quickly walk you through the weaknesses of the other explanations before I talk about the strength, potential strength of the polarity, power-based explanations. Nuclear weapons, for example, are great for explaining peace among countries that have nuclear weapons, but they don't really account for peace between countries that don't have nuclear weapons, or peace between countries, a country that has them and a country that doesn't have them. Just think, for example, about the Cold War. We had two countries with nuclear weapons, the United States and the Soviet Union, but those nuclear weapons did not prevent either of them from invading other countries, like the United States with Korea or with Vietnam, or with like the Soviet Union with Afghanistan. Nor did those nuclear weapons prevent the U.S. and Soviet Union from engaging in a nasty, intense, prolonged great power rivalry. So the existing of nuclear weapons only really prevents one type of war, which is an all-out war for survival, like World War II. We can grant that nuclear weapons have that power, but they do not have the power, they cannot explain all the other declines in violence that we witness, including all the interstate wars and the civil wars. So nuclear weapons are at best a partial explanation. The economic explanation involving economic interdependence is certainly a piece of the puzzle, and yet in some ways it is putting the cart before the horse. In a way, it's the peacefulness, it's the relative peacefulness that has enabled economic interdependence to gain the levels that it has achieved. So in some sense, we can't be sure whether the economic interdependence is causing the peace or the peace is causing the economic interdependence. We're unclear on that existence, on that relationship. And finally, the international institutions, norms, the UN system, peacekeeping, are useful at explaining some of the problems and some of the reasons that you've seen a decline in civil wars within states. They are not particularly good at explaining why you don't have as many interstate wars or great power rivalries. Because as powerful as international institutions are, and as important and useful as the UN is, no one thinks that those institutions are what stops major powers from going after each other. So each of these explanations has part of the story, but they have weaknesses. In particular, the strength of those explanations in some ways are all connected to the issue of polarity or power. Interdependence of the world economy, as I suggested, has spread and flourished in part because of the fact that it's been pushed and supported by key players, especially the United States, European Union, and Japan, and because it benefits from the security among great powers that arguably, at least partly arises as a result of U.S. power and grand strategy. Nuclear weapons are stabilizing in part because there is in place a complex, intense, focused strategy for preventing proliferation of nuclear weapons to new states. And that strategy is only made possible by the polarity of the international system, or at least it's aided by the polarity of the international system and the U.S. effort to prevent proliferation of nuclear weapons to new states. And international institutions and norms in some way function the way they do in part because they benefit from the absence of this great power rivalry. Remember, when was the key moment that the UN system began to function more effectively? What was the key enabling factor that allowed peacekeeping to take off, that allowed new norms of intervention to develop, to allow all of these new mechanisms? The key enabling fact was the end of the Cold War and the ending of that major rivalry. It was that great power rivalry that had locked up the UN and prevented it from operating properly. So even though the United States itself is often a reluctant, negative participant in new norms of conflict resolution, nonetheless, the fact that it prevailed in the Cold War, or the fact that it emerged as the sole superpower after the Cold War, has been an important background enabling feature that has enabled these new norms of peacekeeping and intervention to take place. So for all those reasons, I would like you to at least entertain for the next 10 minutes, while I'm still talking, the possibility that one factor explaining for this, one factor that accounts for this dramatic decline in the war propensity of the international system is indeed this power factor, this emergence of a single superpower world. And that brings me then to the last portion of my talk, which is, will it continue? Will this equilibrium hold? The equilibrium that you've all grown up with in your entire lifetimes, or most of you, this equilibrium of relatively low levels of organized violence in the world. Will it continue? Well, I think that there's a major set of pressures, countervailing pressures on this equilibrium, this favorable equilibrium, from two related sources of change. Sources of change that are going to unfold during your professional lifetime, and sources of change that, as international relations scholars, you will be equipped to watch and to track and to study and to measure. And those two changes are, first and foremost, changes in the distribution of capabilities away from unipolarity, and the second is change in U.S. grand strategy. And these changes are, of course, related. So let me talk about these changes and then say why they might make the world a less peaceful place than it is. First is the international system and its change. There are hundreds of books and articles on the decline of the United States. Many parts of the world, people are very happy about this. They love seeing the U.S. decline. They're sick and tired of the United States. Happy to see them decline. Hundreds of books. And there's lots of ways to think about this changing international system. I'm going to propose to you a very simple way to think about it, which doesn't even use the word polarity. This is a term, a phrase coined by the British scholar of international relations, Barry Buzan, where he called it a 1 plus X world, where you have one superpower, where a superpower is capable of organizing major political and military action pretty much anywhere in the international system. One superpower, and then you have X, some number of great powers. Those are important actors, very significant, but they're not superpowers. One superpower, X great powers. And that's how Steve Brooks and I described the international system in an article we wrote way back in 2001 or 2, I can't remember, where we wrote a paper called for Foreign Affairs called American Primacy in Perspective. We took that Barry Buzan phrase and we said, it's a 1 plus X world. And who out there would disagree? There's really only one superpower. Come on. But things have changed since the 1990s. Are we really still in a 1 plus X world? Many people say we've moved from unipolarity to bipolarity, or multipolarity. Many say we've moved to multipolarity. You go to Russia and talk to my colleagues in Russia, and they all say, it's multipolar. What are you talking about? And I say, you mean that all of these great powers are the same? That the US, China, and Russia are all exactly the same? They say, well, no, but it's multipolar. We don't like unipolarity. And in fact, the way the Russian international relations scholars put it is, they say there was a brief attempt by the US to create a unipolar world, and thanks to action by Russia, China, and other like-minded countries, we stopped that from happening. So we've never had unipolarity, according to the Russians. I think that I could convince you, if you had the patience and the time, that we really are technically still in a unipolar world. But we are not in the same 1 plus X world that existed in the 1990s. I think we've moved from 1 plus X to 1 plus 1 plus X, where there's one superpower, and then there's one state, China, which is not exactly like every other X state. It's a little different. Now here I'll get into dangerous territory by talking about BRICS. We are in Brazil. No IR scholar can come to Brazil and not talk about BRICS. I love them. They're great. I'm all for them. But let's look at these 3 letters. We have B, which I'm crazy about. I'm a big fan of B. We have R. Great. I studied Russia. I can barely speak the language anymore, but I lived there for a long time. We have I, which is a fabulous country, deep culture, big, growing, amazing country. We have S, which is a country with an amazing story about getting rid of apartheid and becoming a responsible player in its region. But is C really the same as B, R, I, and S? Or is it in a different category? I would suggest to you that the C is a big piece of it, and the C is different from all the other letters for one reason and one reason only. It's the power that people think is becoming a superpower. I love Brazil. I'm totally pro-Brazilian. But are people expecting Brazil to become a superpower that is building a global reach capacity? Do people think this of Russia, a country whose demography is declining, whose economy is not doing so well as a resource-dependent economy? Do people even think of India in recent years? When the BRIC term was coined, India was growing very, very fast. Now its institutions seem to be pulling it down. And as much as I love South Africa, no one is thinking of South Africa as a potential superpower. There is one letter in the BRICS which is different. That's China, and China is different because it seems plausible as a peer of the United States, or indeed superior to the United States. The one BRIC that has the possibility to be the new unipolar power, or at least a pole in a bipolar system, which, by the way, was the subject of Liva's thesis yesterday. And that means we are, as opposed to the 1990s, when we studied this and we did the numbers, you looked at the charts, the graphs, every way of thinking about it, and really, China was just another power. In fact, on most measures, Japan was far more impressive than China. That situation, owing to the radical growth of China, has changed, and the expectation in the world is the mentality clearly is we have a new candidate superpower. So we moved from 1 plus x to 1 plus 1 plus x. Now, of course, there's a lot else going on in the international system besides these countries. I've left out changes in the international system that are very important. Rise of newly assertive regional actors. Right now, the state du jour is actually Turkey, and many people are saying you really should have had it be bricked. Put Turkey in there. I love, you know, it's growing fast, but I don't think China wanted this or Russia wanted this because Turkey's a member of NATO. But at any rate, Turkey is not the Turkey that we had 10 years ago at all. It's in a very important region. It's rising fast. It's becoming more capable. It's a popular country, Turkey. So there's lots of these regional states that are becoming more important in the world. But the big thing I want to focus on is this 1 plus 1 plus x change. And that change puts stress on this equilibrium that we've had since 1990. China's story is a story that comes right out of the pages of E.H. Carr, of Robert Gilpin, of even Thucydides. It's a story of a country that faces an international order that was created around it when it was weak. China, for centuries, was one of the most powerful countries in the world and dominated its region of Asia. Unfortunately, for a period, it became weak, the 19th century and especially the 20th century. The current world order was formed when China was in a horrible civil war after the Second World War. It recomposed itself as a state, but was still very, very weak. It faced two nasty superpowers. One, the US, the other, the Soviet Union. And in the 1970s, in the worst period for China, it decided, under Mao Zedong and ultimately Deng Xiaoping, to actually align itself with the United States against China, against the Soviet Union. And that was the period when the US became the preeminent power in Asia. The 1970s, really. It dates from the 1970s, not really 1945. The 1970s, thanks in part to the diplomacy of the hated Richard Nixon, the US emerged as absolutely the prime power, top dog in Asia. And soon, as you know, at the end of that decade, right when this international equilibrium was formed, China adopted dramatic reforms that have led to non-stop 8, 9, 10, 11, 12% growth per year. They now look out at this East Asia and say, you created this system when we were at our weakest and most vulnerable. We are now growing and we want to renegotiate this system. We are not necessarily happy with US primacy in our region. They will tell you right away, we're not talking about global superpower. That's the US game. We live in Asia. Why are you the number one power in our region? They are doing, as John Mearsheimer, my crazy fellow realist, says, they're doing what any great power normally would do. They want to control their environment. But that sets up tension between the existing rules, institutions, order, distribution of goods, and the distribution of power. And what's the U.S. response to this? Does anybody know what we call the U.S. response to this problem? There's a term for it in the United States. Well, you should know it's inside U.S. Politics. Why would you know this down in this lovely country, Brazil? It's called pivot. Namely, the U.S. is engaging in what it calls a strategic pivot, taking forces and efforts out of Europe and Middle East and swinging those forces over to Asia to confront a more powerful China. There is no evidence from the United States that I'm aware of that the U.S. is interested in sharing leadership of Asia. The U.S. officials believe that there's a potential tipping point where if the U.S. makes too many concessions to a rising China, all of the allies the U.S. has now will realize that the future is with China and will tip and switch the balance dramatically in some sort of fundamental game changer over towards China. Therefore, the U.S. is not in a mood to negotiate sharing power in Asia with China. The result is we now have a tension in this system that did not exist when I first started writing about this stuff in the 1990s, did not exist during what we might call the height of the unipolar era. So that's one big international change that is putting pressure on the equilibrium of peace, the relatively peaceful equilibrium that I've been talking about. Namely, we've moved from a 1 plus x world to a 1 plus 1 plus x world, and we don't know how the negotiation is going to work out. we don't know how these two powers are going to reallocate their respective roles in the world in an anarchical setting. The second big change that is pressuring the equilibrium is strong negative pressure growing on this U.S. strategy of global leadership. Is what Americans like to call it. They call it leadership. Others like to call it hegemony or imperialism. I've called it deep engagement. It's a grand strategy that says, for us Americans to be secure, we've got to be involved all around the world. The United States has some 60 to 80, depending on how you count, security partnerships with countries, where it guarantees or is in a mutual security relationship with other countries. There's only 190 countries in the world. 80 of them have formal or informal security ties to the U.S., where the U.S. helps to guarantee their security, or supplies them with weaponry, or pledges to come to their defense if they're attacked. And by the way, you may have read about all these maritime disputes in Asia, where Japan, Philippines, Vietnam, and China are disputing these maritime territories. The U.S. has pledged to come to the assistance of its allies if those lead to war. Indeed, the U.S. has a very weird position on this dispute. It says on the China dispute with Japan over these crazy little islands, the U.S. says, we take no position on the actual substance of this dispute. However, we will abide by our treaty commitment to Japan. So how can you take no position, but then say you'll come to the defense if they're attacked? So technically, my country is pledged to go fight on behalf of Japan if they fight over these little islands sitting out in the middle of the South China Sea. So the strategy the U.S. follows says we're more secure and we're happier and the world is better off, but mainly we're better off if the U.S. engages in these security provision all around the world. That security position enables the U.S. to have a more secure environment for its policies, for the world economy. It also gives the United States what they like to call leadership that enables the U.S. to help forge cooperation with other countries on our terms. We use these security partnerships to leverage other countries to do what we like as opposed to what they might want to do. Best example here is Japan. When's the last time Japan actually opposed something that the United States wanted to do in the global economy? I can tell you when, but it doesn't happen very often. In part because Japan has a security tie with the United States. So that's the logic of the strategy. Go around the world, be the security provider of last resort, be the leader. That's the strategy. And the idea is that that's better for the U.S. itself. Now this strategy is now coming under pressure in a way it has not in my memory. By the way, that strategy really comes from the Cold War. Basically, it's the old strategy the U.S. followed in the Cold War, and then the Soviet Union collapsed, and it just continued the same strategy of maintaining all of these partnerships. So there's pressure on it. Let me give you a sense of the pressure very quickly, and I'll be closing very soon. First, there's intellectual pressure on this strategy. There's intellectual pressure from, guess what? International relations scholars. Now, who cares? A bunch of international relations scholars are critical of the strategy. It's very interesting if you read the U.S., at least the U.S. international security literature, overwhelmingly, scholars, particularly realists, are skeptical of this strategy. And they've been for 20 years arguing against it, saying, look, these alliances are a big mistake because they pull the U.S. into conflicts that are not really American conflicts. Do we really want to fight for Taiwan? Do we really want to fight for South Korea, a country, by the way, that's almost as rich as the United States? Why are we pledged to come to the defense of a wealthy, technologically advanced country like South Korea? Do we really want to fight over these crazy disputes? In fact, maybe the alliance makes things worse because it emboldens these states to make claims and demands they wouldn't make if they didn't have the U.S. alliance. And then there's this problem of what they call free riding, which is, hey, if we got Uncle Sam, we have the United States supplying security, why should we do it ourselves? So most U.S. allies have much lower levels of defense spending than the U.S. Famously, Japan, 1% of GDP. The U.S. is at 4.5% of GDP. Why should we be subsidizing Japanese low levels of defense spending? And the grand strategy, according to these scholars, creates imperial overstretch. All that money the U.S. spends on this grand strategy should be spent on fixing our roads, making our schools better, and keeping our economy growing. And finally, the grand strategy, according to them, creates temptation. Hubris, temptation to do too much, to use military power too much. Famous example here being Iraq. Would the U.S. ever have contemplated such a war had it not had this grand strategy and all of these alliance commitments around the world? In addition to the intellectual pressure, though, there's budget pressure. The U.S. federal budget is under intense stress, and people are looking for places to cut. There is political pressure on this grand strategy in a new way that did not exist before. The U.S. right wing of the U.S. political spectrum is beginning for the first time in my lifetime to question defense spending and to argue that cutting the federal budget is more important than spending on defense. And finally, in addition to all those domestic pressures, there's the international pressure that I've already mentioned. China's rise, going from 1 plus X to 1 plus 1 plus X, makes the strategy more expensive than it used to be. It was easy in the 1990s to be number one all over the place. It's getting a little harder now. Can we afford to continue this strategy? The result? It's more likely than ever that the U.S. might seek to alter its strategy to either revoke or at least renegotiate key alliances and to focus on its own domestic problems. The result could be that you have slow changes in power relationships, but a sudden strategic shift. Because that's how change happens in international politics. There's usually slow incremental change, and then some actor decides on a new strategy. This is, by the way, how the Cold War ended. The Soviet Union was slowly declining. Suddenly you got a new actor named Gorbachev. He tried a new strategy, and suddenly quick change. That's not to say that the strategy changed everything, because the strategy was a result of slow building changes in the international system. Well, similarly today, you can see U.S. decline, pressure, building pressure, and then suddenly there could be, although it's hard to believe, but it could be a big-time strategic shift in Washington that then suddenly speeds up the pace of change. You with me? Okay, so I'm almost done with this talk. Now, in lots of the world, especially countries that are not allies of the United States, this would be, people would say, great! The sooner you guys go home, the better we like it. Russia, China, probably Brazil, I don't know, I have to ask you. They'd all say, great, we're tired of the U.S. strutting around the world, being a leader all the time. Thank goodness, go home, Yankee, we're tired of it. But there are a lot of allies of the United States that would not be so happy. Bear in mind, it is very rare for any country to ask the U.S. to leave these alliances. The Philippines asked us to leave, and then they thought better of it and asked us to come back. So most of these countries want us there. So what would happen very quickly if the U.S. withdrew? Would it be so bad? I think there is a set of problems that would probably emerge that would make the world less secure than it's been over the last 25 years. I think there'd be a general decrease in the security of these regions. In Asia especially, if the U.S. revoked its security commitments, I think Japan and South Korea would probably expand their military capabilities, self-help, take care of themselves, which would almost certainly provoke a potentially dangerous reaction from China. It's highly likely. I think in the Middle East even, allies of the United States would become less secure, including Israel, but not just Israel, Jordan, the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Turkey. With no U.S. backing, they would likely adopt policies to secure themselves that might threaten others and lead to what we call in international relations security dilemmas, where attempts of states to secure themselves lead to insecurity overall. Even in NATO, where Europe is pretty much at peace, who needs the U.S.? I think the withdrawal of U.S. security guarantees might leave Europe even less capable of securing its own neighborhood than it is today. And in addition to that general decrease in security, I think you're likely to see a huge increase in nuclear proliferation. Because a U.S. withdrawal is almost certain to spark a cascade of nuclear proliferation in states such as Egypt, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and Saudi Arabia build their own nuclear forces. And if they build their own nuclear forces, it's likely not to stop there. Their neighbors are going to want their own nuclear forces. The result will be spreading nuclearization, but highly unlikely these countries will build secure, robust, well-defended nuclear postures. They're much more likely to build unstable, unsecured nuclear postures, which means two problems. One, the nuclear deterrence relationships may not be as stable as the ones that we know, especially from the Cold War. And two, a higher likelihood of leakage of nuclear materials to non-state actors. The more nuclear states there are, the more likely leakage. And once they leak, you have non-state actors who cannot be deterred. So for all of those reasons, these nuclear proliferation cascades would be problematic. And I think there'd be a general, given this general decrease in global security, there's likely to be more competitive great power interactions. I'm not forecasting the return of major power war like World War II, but could there be new Cold Wars? New rivalries? Where great powers line up on different sides of disputes? I think yes. I think that would affect the global economy, affect cooperation on sustaining globalization, and even affect international cooperation on things ranging from human rights to climate change. So that's a pretty gloomy picture. Can I bring you back to a positive mood? I don't know. I'm now going to conclude the talk with a few final remarks. I hate to be as gloomy as this, but then I came to Rio and it's raining. If it had been sunny, I would have given you a happy talk about how this trend is going to continue forever. The story that I just laid out to you is consistent with realist theory in large part. It says that orderly, peaceful equilibrium does not arise spontaneously just because people are good, but rather rests on power and political foundations. And as those foundations change, the equilibrium may unravel. But of course, the forecast I gave you is just that. It's a probability. It's a probabilistic argument. No one thinks you can forecast complex things like this with any degree of reliability. All I'm saying is that the recent positive trends in international security are vulnerable, that the future of international security may indeed not be like the recent past. That's a possibility that we need to be aware of. It doesn't mean it's going to happen. In fact, using international relations scholarship, being aware of the possibility, helps people take action possibly to prevent it. There's a possibility that people will craft ways of adjusting to a new distribution of power that preserves or maybe even strengthens this peaceful trend. This is something to work for. After all, the last big change in power relationships, the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, did occur relatively peacefully. So our job is to work to make the next transition as peaceful as the last one was, by flooding the world with highly trained, motivated, smart, committed, young scholars of international relations like you. This institute is doing its part to prevent the bad world that I talked about from emerging. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Wohlforth. It's not usual, but we will open the floor for 5 or 6 questions maximum. 2 blocks of 3. Is that okay?
Whatever you like.
So, if you could raise your hands, please.
Mr. Wohlforth, you emphasized the situation in Asia where things may be shifting from unipolarity to something else. For sure, the US is under stress and China is rising, and Asia is a fundamental piece of the international system. Just for curiosity, is China able to project power outside Asia? What happens if the corrosion of the US prominence in Asia meets Chinese overstretch elsewhere? Thank you.
Why, in your view, why President Obama was not America's Gorbachev?
Get out.
It's just a simple question. I haven't understood what you mean by the expansion of nuclearization in the Middle East or these surrounded areas. Just this.
Okay, well, all great questions. I don't know. The answer on China's rise and whether it will actually become a superpower is one I can't answer. There's a lot of potential roadblocks, stumbling blocks, vulnerabilities, challenges that lie along that path. And I actually think the path to superpower status for China is much longer than most people think. I mean, that goes back to the many features of the system, including especially the fact that China is sitting in a region with other great powers. And unlike the U.S., which has, as we know, the famous phrase, the 4 best allies in the world, Canada, Mexico, the Atlantic Ocean, and the Pacific Ocean. We're sitting between 2 nice, friendly states. They may not like it that much, but they're pretty friendly. And then 2 nice oceans. China does not have that luxury. They have on their border or near their region countries like Japan and Russia and India. And it makes their ability to rise without encountering local pushback a lot harder. Still, it is definitely not the power that it was in the 1990s. And to give you an example of this, there was a crisis over Taiwan in the 1990s. The United States took an aircraft carrier task force and steamed it through the Taiwan Strait under the Clinton administration. This would never happen today unless a wartime occurred. So we're already seeing this change. And it's incumbent on us, as international relations scholars, to look at those changes and think, okay, what will happen if the trend does in fact continue? And as I say, the trend could hasten if the United States makes a political decision, not a decision dictated by power reality, but a domestic political decision to pull back. That would accelerate the potential of China to begin reaching outside of its region. It is possible there could be a period with no superpower, where there's no single state that's kind of the coordinator, the focal point for cooperation. Some people call this apolar world. That's a possibility. But I think more likely that if China keeps running, it will want to control its environment. But again, it could take a long time. I'm going to China in May. I'm told to bring a mask because of the pollution is so bad. And so we know they're facing serious problems. It could be the path towards superpower status for China is probably quite a long time. So I'm talking about decades. This trend of 1 plus 1 plus x, and then 1 plus 1.5 plus x, and then 1 plus 1.75. Before we get to 2 plus x, it's a long road. But there's a lot of political and strategic challenges on that road. What I'm trying to avoid here is the problem with polarity terms, like unipolarity, bipolarity, and multipolarity, is they cause people to think, including me, they cause people to think in dichotomous terms. Either it's this or it's that. Either it's unipolarity or it's bipolarity. We don't have as good a way of thinking about the in-between stages as things change from one to another, and that's what I'm trying to do with that 1 plus 1 plus x. Why is Obama not a Gorbachev? Well, the Republicans claim he is, but Obama has definitely scaled back America. In fact, the U.S. currently, the mood in Washington is currently no more Iraq, no more Afghanistan. It's as strong an anti-interventionist mood as I've ever seen. And by the way, I'm old enough to remember Vietnam, so I remember the post-Vietnam feeling, we can't do this anymore. We're not doing that kind of thing. The Pentagon's planning is based on no more major operations of that nature. That's the plan. Will the United States be able to stick to it? I don't know. But to be a real Gorbachev, Obama would have to really rethink the strategy and say, there's another way to do this that doesn't involve the U.S. claim to be the leader. That's the key word you want to watch. Because that leadership word that comes from Washington is another way of saying we want to stick to this grand strategy of global security management. And Obama has not at all said that. In fact, right now, interestingly, it's the Republican Party, the Conservative Party, that is beginning to move away from the commitment to high levels of defense spending and U.S. interventionism. And the Democratic Party, of which Obama is the head, is still more clinging to the classic leadership narrative. All of the appointments that he's made, I think, are consistent with this, especially John Kerry as Secretary of State. So he's not ready. American politicians are not yet ready for that kind of dramatic shift from the current grant. I'm looking at the wrong person who asked it. Sorry, hasn't made the decision for as dramatic a shift. But what I was suggesting in my talk is that the preconditions are building for potentially a more step function shift away from the current grand strategy. And on proliferation in the Middle East, again, I here rely on what people who study the Middle East tell me and what people from the Middle East say. The king of Saudi Arabia said, if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, we're getting a nuclear weapon. If Egypt is left with no security guarantee from the United States and it's facing a nuclear Israel, it's going to probably want to have nuclear weapons. If Egypt and Saudi get nuclear weapons, how long is it before other countries in the region want to have nuclear weapons? Nuclear weapons are highly attractive things to countries that are in tough geopolitical neighborhoods. The Middle East is tough. The real question is, does the U.S. involvement in the Middle East is a mixed bag. On the one hand, the U.S. enables Israel to do all kinds of stuff, and the U.S. involvement is kind of negative from that perspective. On the other hand, ask yourself this: does Israel become more easy to deal with for this neighborhood without the U.S. security guarantee of Israel, or with it? My forecast as a classic realist is, you take away the U.S. support and Israel gets even worse for its neighbors, even more concerned over its security, even more likely to take action. So I think pulling the U.S. out of the Middle East, even though the U.S. presence there has not been great, would make the region even more volatile, and yes, possibly more subject to proliferation risk.
Okay, another. Renata?
Hi. You seem to give quite a pessimistic account of a U.S. retreat from Asia, but shouldn't we think that China would do the same role as United States does now? So in this case, would you say that identities matter? And why should we think that U.S. hegemony in this region is peaceful and not Chinese ones?
It all depends on a forecast of what happens when countries that currently enjoy U.S. security guarantees no longer have them. And there's two forecasts. One is what you're suggesting, and the other one is what I'm suggesting. One forecast is consistent with my former colleague, Dave Kong, who is now at University of Southern California, who argues that Chinese hegemony, that is to say, legitimate leadership of the region, is the historical norm, and that the problem is the U.S. being involved. And if the U.S. pulls out, then countries like Japan and South Korea, Philippines, and Vietnam will all naturally gravitate to a peaceful China-centric world order. Whereas the more typical realist perspective is these countries are close to China. They like having a security guarantee from a country that's across an ocean. Having a hierarchical hegemonic relationship with a country that's right next to you is more scary from a perspective of maintaining your autonomy, and that they're likely to attempt to increase their military capabilities vis-a-vis China. Do we know which of these two futures will happen? One, smooth adjustment to Chinese hegemony. The second scenario is resistance, autonomous self-help, and security dilemmas. I don't know for sure, but I can say that most people who spend their lives studying the region tell me that the second security dilemma scenario is the more likely of the two. I talk to people who study Japan, and they say right now they cannot imagine that Japan, without the U.S. security guarantee, would simply say, okay, if you look at what's we're fine, we'll just become part of a Chinese-dominated order. Similarly, if you spread the net out wider, similar to countries like Russia, India, but even Vietnam, Philippines, would like to find some alternative to dealing with one great power in your region, which is dominating everything, as opposed to an admittedly pain, problem, U.S., but has the benefit of it's across an ocean from us. And therefore, it's easier to have a hierarchical, hegemonic relationship with an overseas great power than the one right there in front of your face. But truth is, we don't know. And the other scenario could well happen. The only way to find out is to run the experiment by pulling back and seeing what happens.
Hi, thank you. From what I understood, changes in the international system are mainly related to distribution of power, the issue of leadership and polarity, but at the same time it is also related to a matter of perception and expectation of these changes. such as the decline in the expectation of interstate conflicts, the perception that China is a plausible future superpower. So considering this, I would like to know your opinion on the crisis of international institutions, for example, the difficulties of achieving an international consensus on the Syrian crisis. Is it just related to the changes in polarity, or is it about the increasing perception that these institutions are under crisis?
That's a great question, because what we are seeing in Syria is the beginning of the kind of thing I'm forecasting we will see more of as the distribution of power changes. That is to say, two coalitions or groups of major powers lining up on different sides of a civil conflict. There are many reasons for the decline in civil wars, and especially the decline in the lethality, mortality of civil wars, the many number of people they killed. One important explanation, however, is the end of the Cold War. During the Cold War, it was typical for there to be a civil conflict. One side is the government, the other side is the insurgent, and there's one superpower supporting one and the other superpower supporting the other. Usually in the Cold War, it was the US and its allies supporting the government, and it was the Soviet Union supporting the insurgents. Today, we have Russia supporting the government, and the US is supporting the insurgency. Russia would have been way less likely to do that, what it's doing now in the 1990s. That's another case of this moving from the more pure ideal type unipolarity to something that is less unambiguously pure ideal type unipolarity. I think that this question you've hit on a really crucial question. I focused on this disequilibrium between power and the status quo in Asia, but as you rightly say, there's potentially such a disequilibrium across the world, with an institutional structure that is overall powerfully shaped by the US, Europe, and rising countries that are not that happy. Russia claims to be basing its support on principle, that you support legitimate governments, you don't support insurgencies, and the Russians will tell you absolutely convinced that if we stop supporting this insurgency and help Bashar al-Assad stay in power, it might be brutal, nasty, but fewer people would die. It's better for the future to keep the dictator in power than to have this insurgency. But they have a principle that they claim to support of non-intervention, of sovereign immunity, of the inviolability of the sovereignty norm. They don't like what the US and Europe and other countries have done to erode the sovereignty norm and provide international legal justification for intervention. And so that is a norm. The question is that people are contesting. China, by the way, is being a little less forward-leaning on this than Russia. The question comes if, as the power distribution shifts away from this northern US and western coalition in favor of these new conceptions of sovereignty, in favor of countries that are less inclined, do you see more and more struggle over the normative order? I think you do, and therefore that is again why the power shift can be related to the robustness of the international legal, normative, and institutional order. The classic, if I hate to use literature, the classic Robert Gilpin forecast is that as that power distribution shifts, you will see more and more contestation over the norms and rules that underwrite the order. And this would be one instance of it. In fact, however, to back away, it's not that clear. Because first of all, Russia's violated its own principles, by the way, in its own North Caucasus with Georgia. They use the same arguments we used on Kosovo, they use them on Georgia. So, they don't care about consistency. You know the great thing about being a great power?
They say that.
It's like being a parent. When I deal with my kids, I hate to prove this, but when I deal with my kids, it's like, I'm your parent, I don't have to be consistent. Hypocrisy is the first rule of parenting. Well, it's also the first rule of being a great power. We always support this rule, except when we don't. And that's what Russia is doing.
I would like to know what you think would be the role of Central Asia in the coming years, because, well, as you know, Central Asia is next to China. It has many natural resources, which could mean that can be a next spot for the expansion of Chinese influence, but it is also pretty close to Russia, not only geographically, but also because it was part of the Soviet Union. It is also close to the United States, because there are several United States Army bases there. I don't know Army base, but Air Force bases. And whether you think there could be a great game for the region in the next few years or not, because there was that guy, George Friedman, who said that the Himalayas would prevent that from happening.
Well, I love George Friedman, a Stratfor guy, but the great game, I think less likely. Here's one reason, fracking. Okay, so fracking is this new method of getting gas and oil out of the ground. We have it in the United States. It was pioneered there. We are now forecast to become a net oil and petroleum exporter, dependent on, well, there's also a fracking potential in Central Europe. This is the big story coming out of Central Europe, countries like Poland, big time potential shale gas and shale oil. If that, pardon? So, in one sense, it's bad news for global warming advocates because it's making more and more cheap petroleum. In fact, Brazil invested heavily in the biofuels, and if they get fracking, they'll say, why the hell did we invest in that? But at any rate, if the Central Europe fracking revolution occurs like it has in the U.S., the Central Asia will have the Russian gas company and Russian oil company will have less market in Europe for it, and that's going to push it even more towards China, depending on what happens with China. Very quickly, this is a great question though, because it's important to remember this. Everything we see in the world occurs under the current equilibrium of the U.S. In the U.S. as a big leading power that everybody loves to hate. And I think they deserve it. I want to stress very strongly that I do not apologize for many of it's a self-regarding, typical great power acting in its own interest rapaciously, often brutally. But everything that happens is with the U.S. there. And it makes it easy to talk about multipolarity, to talk about alliances, to talk about this, that, and everything, as long as the U.S. is there. And the best example of that is China-Russia cooperation in Central Asia. In fact, there's a competition in Central Asia. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization is partly a Russian move to try to contain and institutionalize China, keep China, because if you just look at the numbers, China should be becoming very dominant in Central Asia. So there's this underneath the scenes kind of contradictions between Russia and China, but we don't see them now because conveniently they both can look at the U.S. and say, the U.S. is the real problem, we're working for multipolarity. Take the U.S. out of the equation, and suddenly I think you do see the Russia-China interests not lining up so easily in Central Asia compared to the past.
Since I'm controlling the microphone, I'll take advantage of that. It's the last question. It's just a quick question. It's something that we are discussing about BRICS actually. Is regarding U.S. policies toward multilateral institutions. I know that institutions, they don't have such a big weight in your picture, but nonetheless, they reduce the costs for the superpower to play. And my question is, in a sense, the rise of China undermines the multilateral institutions, but at the same time, you can see that since the beginning of this century, the United States actually opted for unilateral courses of action, which undermines the multilateral institutions as well. It can be found in Iraq, it can be found in WTO, it can be found all over in DAC, in the Cooperation for Development, and so on and so forth. So in a way, if you have a weak multilateral system, it will benefit China by the end of the day. Because I'm not sure, what I'm not sure is whether or not China will try to reform the multilateral system or to compose a set of bilateral agreements and relationships by itself in expense of the multilateral institution. So in a way, you have a convergence of two odd processes, or odd convergence of two processes. The first one is the rise of China, but the second one is a kind of a withdrawal from the United States from this multilateral world, or from the expectation of reform of the multilateral world.
Well, that's great. I think that I agree fundamentally with everything you said, but there's one thing that I think I might question or push back on a little, and that is that there's some clear trend of U.S. moving away. I think from multilateral institutions as part of its strategy. There was a brief period, and it was only the first administration of George W. Bush, where you actually had people in the White House explicitly saying, we don't really like these institutions. And by the way, the only ones they didn't like were security institutions like the UN and even NATO. They continued to like the WTO, the IMF. They are all free trade Republicans. And so that was a moment. And even in the second Bush administration, they went back to six-party talks, to all these multilateral things. So the U.S. has always been willing to go unilateral when it wants, to force its issue or not. And it's pretty much steady. Rather than a trend going away, I would say it's typical great power behavior. By the way, we're not the only ones. I hasten to add, look at France and Africa. We don't see a lot of, I don't see NATO there. I don't see any UN Security Council resolution supporting their. But at any rate, I can't resist digging at the French. Rises. But that's just a great American pastime. But the bottom line is, you're right, that where would it be taking away this hegemonic actor that is far from perfectly multilateral, let's put it that way. It's flawed, it's self-interested, and even its preferences its preference for global order, for international law, is not, you can say like, let's just for simplicity's sake say there's Europe, okay, very sort of, ICC, R2P, blah, blah, blah. Then there's on the other hand kind of Russia, let's say. China is kind of over on the Russia side. America, U.S. is closer to the Europe, but not all the way over. So the question is, take the U.S. out. Where does that move the equilibrium? I think it moves the equilibrium more towards these powers. I think that the rising countries, the other BRICS, are very much caring about sovereignty, a lot. And so this idea that you're going to make international law really constrain sovereign actors, or that you're really going to have a right to intervene for humanitarian purposes, I don't think China's ever going to be particularly happy about that. Finally, maybe people in this room study, the typical North American scholarship on institutional cooperation, so-called institutional theory. They don't agree on a lot, but one thing they agree on, two things. One is cooperation is easier with institutions than without. Institutions make cooperation easier. And the second is that having a hegemon or an actor with a lot of capability does make cooperation more likely. So as flawed and lame and problematic and self-serving as the U.S. is, I think it actually gets harder to cooperate without it than with it. So for example, just think, climate change deal. You're probably not going to get a good one with the U.S. You're definitely not going to get a good one without the U.S. It's kind of like you've got to have that player in the mix, and you've got to have it motivated to get anything happening. Not that it's going to happen, but the probability goes slightly up. So on balance, recognizing the flaws, I think making the U.S., bringing it home, making it less involved in institutional reform and institutional maintenance will probably result in less cooperation. I think that would be my forecast. As flawed an institutional player as the U.S. is.
Thank you, Professor Wohlforth. I thank you all for coming. We have sorry about it. I have a last invitation to make. We have a colloquium this afternoon at the BRICS Policy Center dealing with private sector and development cooperation. It's at 4 p.m. at the BRICS Policy Center, which is for those who doesn't know. It's a project, IRIS project, it's running at Rua Dona Mariana in Botafogo. It's 4 o'clock over there. You are all invited. Once again, it was an honor to have Professor Wohlforth among us, giving this brilliant lecture this morning, and I thank you all for coming.
que assinar também.